Hey everyone, Matt here again with Critically Contemplate. And today I want to be talking about a interview that I was watching with Alex O'Connor and a man named Konstantin. Alex O'Connor is a guy that has formerly been known as the Cosmic Skeptic. And this Konstantin guy, I honestly hadn't heard of before this interview, but it seems like a really interesting conversation. And there's a section in here that I think is really interesting and worth breaking down a little bit further, hopefully. So let's get right into it.
You just referred to the position that you were sort of arguing against there as people who think that words are harmful. Do you not believe words are harmful, can be harmful? Do you think there's sort of a distinct category difference in the kind of harm that can be caused by words and can be caused by action?
Absolutely. There is a distinct category difference between physical violence and words that are hurtful. You cannot reduce the impact of physical violence. If I smash you in the head with a brick, there is no way for you to be less affected by that because the impact is physical. Words are subjective. Your experience in relation to words that people say to you are subjective. There are things that people can say to me that I would find very hurtful, but you might not at all.
So this is, I think, a really interesting point that's kind of brought up, and I think it's a really good question from Alex. Um, so they're kind of comparing the physical harm to verbal or mental harm, and I kind of get what he's saying as far as, or Constantine is saying, as far as if I hit you in the head with a brick, you obviously have damage. There's obviously going to be like trauma to your head because of that. Um, and I understand the category difference in that thing versus being mean to somebody. However, I don't know if we would say the same thing if we were talking about maybe punching you in the face, which is way less harmful than hitting you in the head with a brick, unless maybe you're getting hit in the face by Mike Tyson or somebody. But let's compare that to now ruining somebody's reputation online or calling them a Nazi, as he's referring to, and maybe calling somebody and getting them fired from their job because of something they said when they were 16 that they happened to record and maybe wasn't a good decision. But regardless, it's a lasting effect. And I think that the time frame of healing is a major factor in how much damage something actually does. And Alex might kind of go into this. I'm not positive. I watched a little bit of this, but like I said, I paused it as I was realizing, hey, this is something I want to talk about. And so I backed up. And so I watched it 2 days ago, that little bit. And so I have no idea what was even said at that point. I just remember thinking it was interesting. But yeah, the time frame of healing is something that I think is important. And so if you get hit with a brick, obviously that's going to take a really long time to heal for you to be back to normal, if you're ever back to normal for that matter. But you could say the same thing about a mental breakdown as well. Um, I can imagine being so hurt mentally from, let's say, like, it's not just one person, because I don't think, and maybe that is the difference though. Maybe the difference is like one can be caused by one person, and I think that to have the mental break, it either has to be somebody really important to you or a mass of people where you just kind of think that the world is against you. So maybe that's a category difference in this. I don't know. I need to think about that a little bit more. But the I can imagine having a mental break from having just multiple people just tell me or say things to me that make me feel unimportant as a person or make me feel less than human. I don't really know, but I think I would be more damaged from that, in mass anyway, than I would from being punched in the face. I don't know how to necessarily compare it with the brick example, because I think that that's like a fatal error, or fatal, like potentially fatal problem. And so maybe in the ways of making you harm yourself, I can kind of compare those things, or driving you to a point to where you want to do that. I can kind of compare the brick example more so to that. But I don't know if I necessarily buy into this. Words don't hurt as much as physical pain, or it's a different kind of hurt, and I don't know. I don't know how well we as humans, at least now, can kind of discuss that pain and kind of compare those things, because they do seem categorically different on face value. But when you really start to think about it and think about the damage that either one can potentially do, they seem to be really close on as far as like the playing field goes. But let's dive back in and kind of see what else they have to say.
And equally, there are things that you might say to me today that I wouldn't find hurtful, but before I did a huge amount of personal growth and personal development and worked on my psyche, which I think is very important, that I would have found very difficult. So the problem with the idea that words are harmful is it introduces the subjective element of it, which is if I say something to you that you find offensive, well, you don't know that what my intentions were with that. You don't know. We don't know how much of the harm that's caused is caused by your interpretation of what I said. If I hit you in the head with a brick, we know that the damage is done by the fact that I physically did that. So that's the difference.
Of course, I mean, we recognize that there would be some instances in which certain forms of words would be more harmful than certain forms of physical action. You know, I could sort of flick you in the side of the head, and that would probably hurt maybe a little bit, but it might not hurt as much as, you know, my mum telling me that she's disappointed in me or something. So there seems to be, there's of course a subjectivity, but it doesn't seem obvious to me that there's this category distinction to make, that physical harm is always worse. And I wonder, is there a sort of moral question that can be raised here? Unless we believe in a soul, unless we're religious, if we're materialists and we think that the mind is just the brain, then to speak of psychological harm and physical harm is really to speak of the same thing, because the mind is just something physical. It's just processes going on in your mind that say, I don't like this. And of course, there's an intuitive difference between the kind of hurt that you feel from words and the kind of hurt that you feel from being hit in the arm or something. But ultimately, it's the same kind of thing going on, which is the brain reacting to stimuli and saying, I don't like this.
Yeah, that is an interesting point when you break it down a little further and just think that like something's hitting you, and so that's causing the nerves to react, and that's sending signals to your brain, which is causing a chemical reaction that is making you either feel pain or be scared or even potentially like have brain damage. And then we're talking about words and feeling stress and or anxiety or anger or depression, and those are just as much chemical reactions in the brain as much as your brain reacting to neurons and stuff from your nerves firing off and sending signals to it. And so yeah, whenever you kind of think about it in that light, maybe they aren't as different as I was saying a little bit ago.
If it's the case that my freedom to swing my fist ends at your nose just because of the physical harm that that's going to bring you about, why doesn't my freedom to swing my language end at your ears, given that it can bring about just as physical harm within your mind? Like, what is the sort of moral difference here?
You're very clever, Alex, but I shouldn't have phrased it that way. You are very clever, and there's no but. I think we all instinctively understand the difference between physical violence and the impact of communication that's non-physical. You cannot protect yourself from me punching you in the face if I'm within the distance where I can do that, right? And you cannot, unless you take painkillers in advance of me punching you in the face, you cannot have that experience be any different. Whereas words, while they can be hurtful, one of the most important things for a human being, for me, is to learn to process words without having an instinctive emotional reaction that is harmful to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think
It's-
it's an analogy that can be pushed because, of course, there are people who sort of condition their shins so that they can be whacked a bunch of times and it just doesn't
Yeah.
hurt. I mean, for me, I think that maybe the distinction lies in the utility of restricting it. I don't know about your views
That's
on
also
this,
true.
but people who are pro-free speech,
I want to pause it real quick just to touch on what he was just saying about you can kind of build up these defenses for words, and kind of going into what Alex is saying here about people being able to build up their shins so they can't feel damage basically or feel pain in their shins. You see that with uh, the monks that punch trees, strengthening up their knuckles, and I get that, and that's kind of on the same way as somebody that I would say is like mentally strong. There's probably a lot of like mental exercises you could do, a lot of meditation you can do that can help you combat these things. However, that's not going to save the monk, even if he's hitting his head against a tree to make it stronger. If that was to work and not give him a concussion right off the bat, but even if he was doing that, that still wouldn't save him from the brick and scenario that Constantine had brought up. Just like somebody could be like super mentally strong, and if everybody in their life turns against them, they're probably not going to handle that very well either. Obviously, I think there's just defenses that you can build up and that can help you prepare for these things. But again, I'm kind of falling back onto the maybe it's not as much of a category difference as I was saying at the beginning.
speech activists, however you want to describe them, I think are often caricatured, although maybe some think this, as saying that if we allow people to say what they want, when they want, with no restriction, we'll live in some kind of utopia where disinformation disappears and everybody gets to the truth and reason prevails. I think that's facile. That's a ridiculous idea. Of course, there's still going to be disinformation. Of course, people are going to be getting hurt and insulted, and there's going to be libel and slander. My position is just that is to trip over myself to recognize that yes, free speech comes at a cost. That's why it's so valuable. But if it was just this wonderful thing that brought about obvious benefits, then everybody would be trivially in favor of it. It has to come at some cost, and the cost is that it is going to cause this harm. But that restricting freedom of speech, at least excessively, is almost always going to be worse in a way that maybe physical harm isn't. You can say, yes, physical harm is really bad, but I don't think you can say similarly something like restricting physical harm will end up being worse, unless you worry that the government's going to overstep.
And that's where we come back to the fact that we all instinctively understand the difference between the harm that words do and the harm that physical actions do. That's why we don't ever have the conversation of, well, maybe we should allow people to punch each other because that would, there is trade-offs with that we really want. I think that's also the difference as well. It's like you have to regulate physical violence. You don't necessarily have to regulate language in the same way because, as you say, the negative trade-offs are very, very bad. If you look at societies that restrict people heavily in terms of the comedy, the satire, their ability to express and share and debate ideas, those are generally not the societies that anybody watching or listening to this would want to live in. And
yes.
That's a kind of parallel. So I'm not someone who philosophizes too much about these things. I think
I do think that that's an interesting point as well, is saying that we limit physical violence, but he's saying that we shouldn't limit free speech. That would, because comparing those two things, that would be like, it's basically saying that we can fight each other for no reason in the streets all the time. Obviously, we don't want that. We don't need that. That's not beneficial to our society. Something else that kind of brings me to it as a thought, and this is a little bit on the Kantian side or Kantian side. I'm not really positive how to um, pronounce that, I guess. But this idea that I believe that our morality, for the most part, is objective. I think there's a lot of gray areas where we bring in subjectivity to it, or some of those objective ideas get expanded on, and there then the subjectivity kind of comes in. And so, with that being said, I think that a lot of like our moral understanding and things that we preserve for not only ourselves but our society are things that are evolutionarily innate. And so I think that as we evolved as a species, we obviously want to be able to reproduce to prolong the lifespan of our species as a whole. And I think that's something that is evolutionarily innate, if I can get that word out. And I think that that kind of expands into all these other facets of, that's why murder is wrong and why we don't just go around um, harming everybody all the time. And so I get that we have those distinctions, but I don't know how we necessarily, or we don't go around murdering people, because if we everybody did that, we wouldn't have a society left to prolong our species. And like I said, I think that that's something that we have innate in us. And I think that we can take that and be like, well, why don't we do that for these language ideas as well? As far as if everybody ran around um, insulting everybody all the time, would that be beneficial? Or on a as far as harm goes, would that do as much harm as potentially harming people physically? So I think it's a really interesting topic to really kind of discuss and kind of dive deep into. And hopefully in a future video, we can take the time to actually dive really deep into that concept. But let's continue on for a little bit. Just want to see if they kind of wrap this segment up.
There's a lot of wisdom in empiricism and observing what is true across different societies, and that's kind of one of the things I'm talking about in the book, which you're holding up, which is
I haven't waved around yet.
This wasn't an attempt to plug it. I'm just trying to say that my attitude to many things is not based. I don't have as much faith in philosophy as I think a lot of people do. I'm interested in what works and what doesn't work. And my opposition to restrictions of speech is not based on some deeply worked out philosophical concept. It's just, I observe that societies that allow people to speak freely are better than societies that don't.
In the book, you describe the suppression of free speech as a symptom.
I agree with that for the most part, but I also don't think that what he's talking about is in that aspect of what he's saying, as far as uh, societies don't work that don't allow free speech. So I believe that there should maybe not be a necessarily platform for people that give out misinformation, but I do think that they should have a space to speak. And I think that I hate this term kind of, but all of that should take place in the marketplace of ideas, if you will. And so I I get that he's trying to say that, but then he's also trying to loop in these other concepts of like it almost seems like insulting people is on the table now, because free speech is open and we can have these discussions about these other topics just to make sure that as a society, we are believing in the correct and true things. And I think that we need to have good conversations about that. And I think that those conversations should be open to the public for the most part. And so I get that. I just think he's trying to loop two things in, and he's kind of, I don't think he's like maliciously doing this, just to say, but I think that he's just talking about free speech. And in this instance, he's talking about being able to kind of talk about these ideas and what kind of works and all this stuff. But on the other hand, it almost seems like he's looping in like insulting and harming people mentally. And I don't know if we should do that. I think we can figure out the difference in those and maybe pick what works and throw away the bad instead of just taking it all.
Symptom of tyranny. Do you think it is just a symptom or also a cause, or is it more one or the other? If you see the suppression of free speech, do you think that's more likely the result of tyranny or the cause of tyranny?
So I do want to pause there and stop the video. Just kind of give my final thoughts on this because I think they're going into another subject that kind of touches on some things I don't really want to touch on this video. But I think overall, I think it, like I said, it is a deep dive, or it'll be an interesting deep dive to kind of talk about this question of morality when it comes to the differences between physical and mental harm and how we kind of weigh those things. I hope that I can get to that in a future video, and I plan to. But I think that this was a really interesting conversation. Alex O'Connor is a guy that I've watched for quite a while, and try to. I think he's a really, really skilled speaker and debater. I think he's very quick on his feet as coming up with examples and ideas that are really challenging. And even if he doesn't hold those, he's still really good at kind of being the devil's advocate in some of these conversations just to make the conversation flow really well and make sure that the person actually has a chance to really back up their claims that they're making. And so hopefully hopefully I can do something even close to the same because I think he does an amazing job. This Konstantin person seems really well spoken. I want to find out a little bit more of him and kind of see what his story is. Maybe have another video like this that's just kind of breaking down some of the things he talks about more himself, or maybe not in a debate or discussion type of video, and just kind of really break that down and kind of get a better idea of what he means whenever he's talking about words. Because I think I had some challenges in this video so far to how we actually quantify the harm being done that I think are really good points that I would like to hear his answers on. Not that I think I'm going to have a conversation with him, at least not anytime soon. We'll see. But yeah, I do want to take a bit of a deeper dive into all of these topics in a future video, but hopefully I gave a little bit of insight and kind of my process of thinking in this video. And yeah, so, well, thanks for watching. Again, this is Critically Contemplate with Matt. I have some videos that I did up on the sides, and hopefully you find one of those that interests you. And if I don't have anything there yet, it's because I haven't made a video to put there yet. So just stay tuned and I'll have some here soon. But thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.